6 days. That was the record. Most executive assistants ran out of the downtown high-rise before their first paycheck even cleared. You don't manage schedules for the Russo syndicate without quickly realizing exactly what those international shipping manifests imply. They left crying. They left terrified. Then came Chrissy. She didn't have a background in criminal logistics. She had $17 in her checking account, a broken umbrella, and a caffeine tremor that made her a walking disaster. She didn't just survive the week, she brought the boss to his knees. The corner office on the 42nd floor smelled of stale espresso and expensive leather. It was a sterile, unforgiving room, much like the man who occupied it. Matteo Russo stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop, massaging the bridge of his nose. Running a criminal empire in the 21st century was less about smoking guns and more about spreadsheets. The romance of the Sicilian Mafia died decades ago, replaced by shell corporations, offshore tax havens, and union negotiations. It was exhausting, and right now, Matteo was doing it without an assistant. Again. "She's gone, boss," Lincoln said, leaning against the heavy mahogany doorframe. Lincoln was Matteo's second-in-command, a man who wore custom suits that couldn't quite hide the bulk of his shoulder holster. Which one was this? Matteo didn't look up from his screen. Sarah. Or maybe Samantha, the blonde from the temp agency. She saw Jimmy the Nose dragging that rug out of the freight elevator this morning, started hyperventilating in the break room. I gave her 3 months severance in cash and told her to forget the address. Matteo sighed, a harsh, scraping sound in the quiet room. "I need someone to answer the phones, Lincoln. I need someone to organize the Port Authority bribes so they don't overlap with the sanitation payouts. It's not difficult. I just need someone who doesn't ask questions and doesn't burst into tears." Normal people don't do well here, Matteo. The vibe is intense. Just get me another one. And tell the agency to scrape the bottom of the barrel. I don't want a bright-eyed graduate looking for corporate mentorship. I want someone too desperate to care. The next morning, it was raining. Not a gentle drizzle, but a cold, driving downpour that turned the city sidewalks into grey sludge. Chrissy Outlaw stood in the ground-floor lobby of the Russo building, trying to discreetly wring out the hem of her thrift store skirt. She was 24, chronically sleep-deprived, and currently vibrating with the kind of low-level panic that comes from living entirely on credit cards and hope. Her left shoe squeaked. The sole was cracking, letting in the damp. She checked the floor directory. Russo Logistics. Floor 42. The elevator ride felt like an execution march. She needed this job. Her father's medical bills from the stroke were piling up on her kitchen counter, forming a terrifying paper mountain. The diner where she worked nights had just cut her hours. When the sketchy temp agency called her at 6 a.m., offering triple the standard hourly rate for an immediate start, high-stress administration role, she hadn't asked questions. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to a reception area that cost more than Chrissy's life. Sleek black marble, minimalist lighting, and total silence. Lincoln was waiting at the reception desk. He looked her up and down. His gaze was entirely devoid of warmth, calculating her worth in fractions of a second. He took in the damp skirt, the squeaking shoes, the nervous grip on her cheap canvas tote bag. "You're the new temp," Lincoln stated. It wasn't a question. "Chrissy, yes. Hi. I'm sorry about the water. I'll mop it up." She stepped forward, her wet shoe finding the only polished tile not covered by the entrance mat. Her legs went entirely out from under her. It wasn't a graceful stumble. It was a spectacular, flailing collapse. Her tote bag flew open, vomiting a chaotic mix of loose pens, a half-eaten granola bar, crumpled diner receipts, and a single, tragic-looking tampon across the pristine marble floor. Chrissy lay flat on her back for 3 seconds, staring at the recessed lighting. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just let out a long, hollow breath, contemplating whether it would be easier to just stay on the floor forever. A shadow fell over her. She tilted her head back. Standing above her was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and bad intentions. Matteo Russo had dark hair brushed back from a sharp widow's peak, eyes the colour of bruised storm clouds, and a jawline that belonged on a Roman coin. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with predatory perfection. He stared down at her. He looked at the granola bar. He looked at the tampon. He looked at her wet, cracked shoes. "Are you injured?" Matteo asked. His voice was a low, resonant rumble. There was no concern in it, only a dry, factual demand. "Only my pride," Chrissy muttered, scrambling to her knees. She frantically began scraping her belongings back into her bag. "I'm so sorry. The floor is very slippery, and my shoes are, well, they're terrible. I'm here for the assistant job." Matteo looked over at Lincoln. Lincoln gave a microscopic shrug. "You have 5 minutes to dry off," Matteo said, turning away. "Then I need the quarterly projections printed, bound, and on my desk. Don't bleed on them." Chrissy froze, a pen halfway to her bag. She looked at her hand. She had scraped her knuckle on the marble, and a tiny bead of red was welling up. By the time she looked up, the tall man was gone. "Welcome to Russo Logistics," Lincoln said dryly, tossing her a box of tissues. "Desk is on the left. Day 3. That was usually when the cracks showed." Matteo watched Chrissy through the glass partition of his office. She was a disaster, yet utterly mesmerizing in her chaos. In the past 72 hours, she had jammed the industrial copier twice, knocked over a very expensive ficus plant, and accidentally hung up on the boss of the Irish mob. Matteo had spent 20 minutes laughing in his private bathroom over that last one. Old Man O'Connor had been furious, and Chrissy had simply told him, "Sir, your tone is unprofessional," before hitting the disconnect button. She was clumsy. She bumped into door frames. She dropped folders. But Matteo, a man who noticed everything, noticed the why. She wasn't careless. She was exhausted. He saw the way her eyes drooped when she thought no one was looking. He noticed that she arrived at 7 a.m. smelling faintly of cheap frying oil, grease from a second job. He saw the frantic, desperate math she did in the margins of her notepad, adding up numbers that looked suspiciously like utility bills. The men in Matteo's orbit were predators. The capos, the soldiers, the politicians he bought. They all moved with calculated grace. They took up space. Chrissy shrank. She tried to make herself invisible, scurrying around the edges of the room. Yet, when a 250-pound enforcer named Bricks cornered her by the water cooler to bark an order, she didn't flinch. She just handed him his espresso and told him to use a coaster. It was baffling. "Here are the Thursday manifests, Mr. Russo." Chrissy bumped the doorframe as she entered, her shoulder colliding with the wood with a dull thud. She didn't acknowledge it. She just walked straight to his desk, balancing a stack of manila folders and a ceramic mug of black coffee. "Put them down," Matteo murmured, not looking up from his tablet. She leaned over the desk. The heel of her shoe caught on the edge of the Persian rug. It happened in slow motion. Matteo saw her weight shift, saw her eyes go wide, saw the ceramic mug tip past the point of no return. The coffee hit the desk like a tidal wave. It washed over the polished wood, soaking into the edges of a leather-bound ledger. A ledger that contained the handwritten, undigitized routing numbers for 3 illegal casinos. The office went completely silent. Outside the glass, Lincoln stopped talking to a lieutenant. Everyone in the bullpen saw it happen. Everyone knew what that ledger was. Everyone knew Matteo's temper. Chrissy stood frozen. Her hands were still hovering in the air. Matteo slowly set his tablet down. He looked at the spreading brown stain. He looked at the soaked ledger. Then he raised his eyes to meet hers. He expected tears. He expected trembling. He expected her to grab her cheap canvas bag and run for the elevators like the others. Instead, Chrissy let out a sound of pure, unadulterated frustration. "Damn it," she whispered. Not in fear of him, but in anger at herself. She didn't apologize immediately. She lunged forward, grabbing the sleeves of her oversized, cheap polyester cardigan, and actually threw herself over the desk, using her own clothes to soak up the boiling hot coffee before it could seep further into the pages. "What are you doing?" Matteo barked, startled, pushing his chair back. "Saving the ink," she gasped, pressing her ruined sleeves hard against the wet leather. "The pages are thick. If I press hard enough, it won't bleed through to the actual numbers. Don't just sit there. Hand me the napkins from your drawer." Matteo was so stunned by the command that he actually obeyed. He pulled open his desk drawer, grabbed a handful of cocktail napkins from a catered lunch, and handed them to her. She worked frantically, dabbing and pressing. Her hands were turning red from the heat of the liquid, but she ignored it. "Okay," she breathed after a minute, peeling her ruined sweater back. She carefully opened the cover of the ledger. The edges were stained brown, but the ink on the pages remained crisp and legible. She slumped back, blowing a strand of frizzy brown hair out of her face. She looked at her sweater. It was completely destroyed, clinging to her arms, dripping brown liquid onto the floor. Only then did she look at him. The reality of who she was dealing with seemed to finally hit her. Matteo was standing now. He was 6'3", broad-shouldered, and entirely capable of throwing her out the window. "I am so sorry," she said. Her voice was quiet now, defeated. "I'll pack my things." Matteo looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her red, blistered hands. She had burned herself to save a book she didn't even understand the importance of, simply because it was her job. "Don't be dramatic," Matteo said, his voice surprisingly soft. It surprised even him. "Go to the executive washroom, run cold water over your hands. There's a first aid kit under the sink." Chrissy blinked. "You're not firing me?" "If I fired you, I'd have to find someone else to clean this up." He pointed to the desk. "Go, now, before those blister." She practically fled the room. Lincoln pushed the glass door open, looking at the mess. "Boss, you okay? Should I call the agency and tell them to send a—" "No," Matteo interrupted, staring at the wet footprints Chrissy had left on the carpet. "She stays. She nearly destroyed the West Side betting slips. She saved them using her own clothes, Lincoln. The last girl cried when the Wi-Fi went down. This one just tries to fix it." Matteo touched the damp leather of the ledger. "Have someone go down to the boutique in the lobby. Buy a blouse and a sweater, size small, and get some burn cream from the pharmacy." Lincoln raised an eyebrow, a silent question hanging in the air. "Do it," Matteo snapped. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Friday. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a grid of glittering gold and harsh neon, a sprawling beast that Matteo owned a significant chunk of. The office was entirely dark, save for the pool of amber light radiating from the desk lamp in Matteo's private suite. He rubbed his eyes, the text on his monitor blurring. A shipment of medical-grade fentanyl, the legitimate kind, hijacked from a pharmaceutical rival before it hit the black market, was stuck in a rail yard in New Jersey. The union boss was holding it for a higher bribe. The delay was costing Matteo 6 figures an hour. Tensions had boiled over earlier in the day. A capo had come in screaming, throwing an ashtray against the wall. Through it all, Chrissy had sat outside, dutifully typing, flinching only once when the glass shattered. Matteo thought she had gone home hours ago, but when he finally pushed away from his desk and walked out into the bullpen to pour himself a scotch from the cart, he saw the glow of a single monitor in the corner. Chrissy was still there. She had kicked off her squeaky shoes. She was sitting cross-legged in her ergonomic chair, wearing the oversized, incredibly expensive cashmere sweater Lincoln had procured for her after the coffee incident. It swallowed her whole. She was squinting at her screen, surrounded by a fortress of shipping manifests and highlighted maps. Matteo walked over quietly. The carpet absorbed the sound of his heavy footsteps. He stood behind her for a full minute before she noticed. "Why are you still here, Chrissy?" She shrieked, a small, undignified sound, and nearly sent her keyboard flying. She spun around, clutching her chest. "Jesus, Mr. Russo, do you have to materialize out of the shadows like Batman?" Matteo didn't smile, but a strange, warm pressure eased in his chest. No one spoke to him like that. They called him Sir. They looked at the floor. "You're off the clock," he said, taking a sip of his scotch. "The agency doesn't pay overtime after 9. "I know," she said, turning back to her screen. She rubbed her temples. But the manifest for the Newark freight train didn't make sense. And honestly, I didn't want to go back to my apartment. The heat is broken, and my landlord is ignoring my texts. Matteo frowned. The idea of her shivering in some run-down apartment bothered him more than the missing shipment. "So you're staying here to steal my electricity?" "I'm staying here to fix this," she corrected him, tapping a pen against her monitor. "The guy who runs the rail yard, Callahan, he's been rerouting the cargo trains through track 4. Matteo stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder. He smelled vanilla and the faint, sterile scent of the burn cream she was still applying to her hands. "How do you know that?" "Because," she pulled up a satellite map of the New Jersey rail system. "Track 4 has a blind spot, no security cameras, but it also has a weight limit on the bridge just past the junction. He's holding your train at the depot, claiming union strikes, but look at the maintenance logs. The bridge is scheduled for structural repair on Monday. He can't move a fully loaded freight train over it until Tuesday anyway. He's not extorting you for money because he has leverage. He's extorting you because he's stalling. He literally can't move the train." Matteo stared at the screen. He looked at the structural logs she had pulled from a public city planning website. She was right. The fat Irish bastard was bluffing. "You cross-referenced our shipping routes with municipal bridge maintenance schedules?" Matteo asked, his voice low. Chrissy shrugged, looking suddenly self-conscious. "I used to do logistics for a pizza delivery franchise. If a road was closed, the pizza got cold. You just have to know the city grid. It's the same principle, just bigger boxes." Matteo let out a short, quiet laugh. The sound startled her. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide. "Pizza delivery," he repeated. He looked down at her, really looked at her. Beneath the frizzy hair and the exhaustion, she had a sharp, relentless mind. She didn't flinch away from the work. She didn't ask what was in the boxes. She just solved the problem. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, shrinking back slightly. "No," Matteo said. He reached out and gently took the pen from her hand, setting it on the desk. "You just saved me about $500,000. Chrissy blinked. "Oh, cool. Do I get a bonus?" It was a joke. She delivered it with a dry, self-deprecating smile. But Matteo didn't smile back. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes. He thought of her broken heating. "Yes," Matteo said softly. "Pack your things. I'm taking you to dinner." "Mr. Russo, it's midnight. Nothing is open." I own 3 restaurants in this zip code, Chrissy. One of them is about to open up. He stepped back, gesturing to her shoes. Put your shoes on. We're leaving. I'm not exactly dressed for a fancy place, she protested, pulling the cashmere sleeves over her bandaged hands. I don't care what you're wearing, Matteo said. And as he watched her fumble with the straps of her worn-out heels, he realized with a sudden, unsettling clarity that he meant it. For the first time in 10 years, Matteo Russo wasn't thinking about blood, or money, or leverage. He was just thinking about making sure the clumsy girl who fixed his problems finally got a warm meal. The restaurant was called L'Ombra. Tucked down a cobblestone alley in the financial district, its iron gates were usually locked tight by 11. Tonight, the heavy oak doors were propped open, and the faint, sharp smell of melting garlic and toasted chili flakes drifted out into the damp street. Matteo sat across from Chrissy in a secluded corner booth. The dining room was completely empty, the chairs stacked on the tables everywhere except for their small island of dim, flickering candlelight. By the door, Lincoln stood with his back to them, silently scrolling through his phone, an ever-present sentinel in a tailored suit. A nervous, sleepy-eyed chef placed 2 steaming porcelain bowls of spaghetti aglio e olio between them, along with a basket of warm, crusty bread. He didn't offer a menu. He didn't ask for a wine order. He just nodded to Matteo and vanished back into the kitchen. Chrissy stared at the bowl. The pasta glistened with olive oil, dusted with fresh parsley and a heavy grating of hard cheese. Her stomach gave a loud, violent rumble that echoed in the quiet room. She froze, her face flushing crimson. She pressed a hand to her stomach. I'm sorry. I haven't eaten since a granola bar at 7 this morning. Eat, Matteo said simply. He picked up his own fork, but he didn't look at his food. He looked at her. She tried to be polite for exactly 2 bites. After that, the sheer primal hunger took over. She didn't gorge herself like an animal, but she ate with a focused, methodical desperation that told a story Matteo recognized instantly. It was the way men ate in prison. It was the way kids ate in the slums of Palermo when they didn't know if there would be dinner tomorrow. He watched her tear a piece of bread and drag it through the leftover oil in her bowl. Tell me about the pizza delivery, he said. His voice was a low rumble in the empty restaurant. Chrissy paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. She chewed quickly and swallowed, suddenly self-conscious again. There isn't much to tell. I drove a beat-up Honda Civic for 2 years. Delivered in the Heights, mostly. You learn the traffic patterns. You learn which alleys to avoid and which apartment buildings have broken buzzers. And the second job? The diner? She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin. The cashmere sweater still swallowed her frame, making her look entirely out of place against the tufted leather of the booth. Who said I work at a diner? You smell like industrial fryer grease every morning at 7, and you have faint burn marks on your forearms that don't come from an office printer. Matteo leaned back, swirling a glass of sparkling water. I make it my business to know the people who work for me, Chrissy, but you don't fit the profile. What profile? Desperate enough to ignore the blood on the floor, but stupid enough to think they won't eventually step in it. The bluntness of the statement hung in the air. The faint clatter of pans from the kitchen seemed suddenly very far away. Chrissy didn't flinch. She just looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. My father had a stroke 8 months ago, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of pity. It was a practiced recitation of a nightmare. He was a contractor, cash in hand, no insurance. He's in a long-term rehabilitation facility now. It costs $6,000 a month. If I miss a payment, they move him to a state ward. Have you ever seen a state ward, Mr. Russo? Matteo, she blinked. Excuse me? Call me Matteo. We aren't in the office. She swallowed hard. Have you ever seen a state ward, Matteo? Yes, he answered quietly. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The coldness in his eyes told her he knew exactly what that kind of hell looked like. I don't care what you ship, Chrissy said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She leaned across the table. I don't care who you bribe or what Lincoln carries under his jacket. I don't care about the ledger. I need the paycheck. I will balance your books. I will fix your manifests. And I will pour your coffee. But don't look at me like I'm a stray dog you let in out of the rain. I'm here because I choose to be. Because the alternative is worse. Matteo sat perfectly still. He was a man who commanded an army of killers. He had broken men in half for raising their voices in his presence. Yet here was this exhausted girl, drowning in oversized cashmere, looking him dead in the eye and drawing a line in the sand. A slow, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It changed his entire face. The sharp, predatory angles softened, revealing a glimpse of the man buried beneath the boss. I don't think you're a stray dog, Chrissy, Matteo said softly. He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand coming to rest near hers. He didn't touch her, but the heat of his skin was palpable. I think you're the smartest person in my building. Chrissy stared at his hand. Her chest tightened. For the first time all day, she wasn't thinking about her father, or her debt, or her broken heater. She was intensely, terrifyingly aware of the man sitting across from her. Eat your bread, Matteo ordered gently, pulling his hand back. Tomorrow, you're going to reorganize the offshore accounts. You'll need the energy. By week 4, the impossible had happened. The Russo Syndicate office had achieved a state of terrifying, seamless efficiency. Chrissy had stopped bumping into door frames, mostly because she had memorized the exact spatial dimensions of the 42nd floor. The capos, men with nicknames like Tommy the Hammer and Silencers, no longer barked orders at her. Instead, they approached her desk with the cautious reverence of people approaching an unexploded bomb. She held the calendar. She controlled the flow of Matteo's day. To get to the boss, they had to go through her. Chrissy, sweetheart, Bricks rumbled, leaning his massive, tattooed forearms on the edge of her reception desk. He delicately placed a pink cardboard box next to her keyboard. I brought you a cannoli from the bakery in Little Italy, the good kind, with the pistachios. Chrissy didn't look up from her dual monitors. She was color-coding a spreadsheet that tracked illegal gambling revenues across 3 boroughs. Thank you, Bricks. But if you're trying to get a sit-down with Matteo before Thursday, the cannoli isn't going to work. He's booked solid. Bricks sighed heavily, a sound like a deflating tire. Come on, it's about the docks. The Russians are sniffing around Pier 42 again. He needs to know. Put it in a memo. I'll slide it into his afternoon briefing folder. A memo? Bricks looked horrified. I don't write memos. I break legs. Then find someone whose legs aren't broken to dictate it for you, Chrissy said, mildly, finally looking up and offering him a polite, practiced smile. Thursday at 2 p.m. I'll pencil you in. Bricks grumbled, but he didn't argue. He just nodded and lumbered away. Inside the glass office, Matteo watched the exchange. A deep, quiet satisfaction settled in his chest. She was magnificent. She had taken a room full of apex predators and reduced them to middle management. She didn't do it with fear. She did it with relentless, weaponized administration. But the bubble of safety she had built couldn't last forever. The world they operated in was fundamentally broken, and broken things have sharp edges. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Lincoln was downstairs overseeing a delivery, leaving the floor unusually light on security. The elevator chimed. Chrissy didn't look up immediately, assuming it was one of the couriers. Packages go in the bin by the door, please." No one answered. Heavy boots stepped onto the marble floor. Chrissy looked up. It wasn't a courier. It was a man she didn't recognize. He was wearing a cheap leather jacket, and half of his face was covered in a jagged, poorly healed scar. Two other men flanked him. They didn't have the tailored, restrained look of Matteo's men. They looked hungry, reckless, and high on something synthetic. "Where's Russo?" the scarred man demanded. He didn't stop at the visitor line. He walked right up to Chrissy's desk, planting his hands on the wood. He smelled like stale beer and copper. Chrissy's heart slammed against her ribs. The adrenaline spiked so fast, she tasted metal on her tongue. The primal urge to run screamed in her head, but she couldn't. If she ran, they would go straight for the glass door behind her. She took a slow, deep breath, burying her shaking hands in her lap. "Do you have an appointment?" Chrissy asked. Her voice was remarkably steady. The scarred man laughed. It was an ugly, grating sound. "I don't need an appointment, sweetheart. I have a message from Dominic. Tell Russo to come out of here before we go in there and drag him out." He reached out, grabbing the edge of her monitor and violently shoving it aside. It crashed to the floor, the screen shattering. Chrissy flinched, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, she didn't look at the broken plastic. She looked directly at the man's chest. "I'm going to need you to step back behind the blue line on the floor, sir," Chrissy said. She reached for the landline phone on her desk, her fingers hovering over the receiver. "This is a private corporate office. If you have a grievance, you can fill out a visitor's request form." The man stared at her, genuinely baffled by her reaction. "Are you stupid, bitch? I just told you—" He reached across the desk, his dirty hand lunging toward the collar of her blouse. He never made contact. The glass door of the inner office slammed open so hard it cracked the hinges. Matteo crossed the 20 feet of carpet in less than 3 seconds. He moved with a speed that defied his size. It was pure, distilled violence. He grabbed the man's extended arm, twisted the wrist backward until a loud, sickening snap echoed through the room, and drove the man's face directly into the heavy oak of Chrissy's desk. The man screamed, a muffled, bloody sound against the wood. The other two thugs reached for their jackets, but Matteo was already moving. He kicked the knee of the man on the left, snapping the joint backward, and caught the third man by the throat, driving him violently into the plaster wall. It was over in 10 seconds. The room fell dead silent, save for the wet groans of the men on the floor. Matteo stood amidst the wreckage. His chest was heaving, his eyes entirely black with a rage so absolute it seemed to suck the air out of the room. He looked like the monster the stories claimed he was, the ruthless, untouchable king of the city's underworld. He dropped the man he was holding against the wall. The thug slumped to the floor, unconscious. Slowly, Matteo turned around. He looked at the shattered monitor. He looked at the blood smeared on the edge of the desk. Then he looked at Chrissy. She was still sitting in her chair. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't run, but she was trembling so violently that the heavy desk rattled against the floorboards. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide and fixed on the blood pooling near her keyboard. The monster vanished. Matteo's posture broke. He stepped around the groaning man on the floor, ignoring him completely, and knelt beside Chrissy's chair. He didn't care that his custom suit was touching the blood on the carpet. He reached up, his large, blood-spattered hands hovering an inch from her face, terrified to touch her, terrified he would break her. "Chrissy," he breathed. His voice was raw, frantic. "Did they touch you? Tell me if they touched you." She slowly dragged her eyes away from the desk to meet his. She shook her head. A single tear broke free, tracking through the dusting of face powder on her cheek. She choked on the word. She took a shuddering breath. I told him to fill out a form. A broken, breathless sound escaped Matteo's chest. It might have been a laugh. It might have been a sob. He couldn't hold back anymore. He closed the distance, wrapping his hands gently around her face, his thumbs brushing away the tear. Her skin was freezing cold. "You did perfectly," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of vanilla and fear. "You did perfectly, Mia cara. I've got you. I've got you." The elevator dinged. Lincoln stepped out, his gun already drawn, taking in the carnage. Matteo didn't look up. He didn't care about the bodies on the floor. He didn't care about Dominic's message. He only cared about the trembling girl in his arms, and the sudden, terrifying realization that he would burn the entire city to the ground before he let anyone frighten her again. The smell of industrial bleach is distinct. It strips the air of oxygen and coats the back of your throat in a harsh chemical film. 20 minutes after the glass shattered, a crew of men in unmarked grey jumpsuits arrived on the 42nd floor. They moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't speak. They brought heavy-duty trash bags, mop buckets, and a new pane of frosted glass for the office door. The man with the shattered knee and the man with the broken wrist had already been dragged out through the freight elevator by Lincoln and Bricks. Chrissy sat on the leather sofa in Matteo's inner office. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a heavy crystal tumbler of water, though she hadn't taken a single sip. The ice cubes clinked together, betraying the fine tremor still rattling through her bones. Matteo stood by the window, his back to her, watching the city below. He had shed his ruined suit jacket. The sleeves of his white button-down were rolled up to the elbows, exposing a fading network of scars on his forearms that told a history Chrissy had never asked about. He was on the phone, speaking rapidly in a dialect of Italian that sounded harsh and percussive, completely unlike the smooth, romanticized version from the movies. He hung up, tossing the phone onto his desk. "The agency is sending a car for your belongings at your apartment," Matteo said, without turning around. The tension in his shoulders was rigid, carved out of stone. "You are not going back there. Dominic's men are stupid, but they know how to follow a paper trail. Your address was in the employee file." Chrissy stared at the water in her glass. "I have a cat." Matteo paused. He turned to look at her, genuinely thrown off balance. "You have a cat. You never mentioned a cat. He's a stray. He sleeps on the fire escape. I leave food out for him. He only has one ear. If I'm not there, he won't eat." It was a ridiculous thing to fixate on. 3 men had just tried to beat her to death to get to her boss, and she was worrying about a feral alley cat. But the human mind is fragile, and in the face of catastrophic trauma, it latches onto the mundane to survive. Matteo stared at her for a long time. The harshness in his eyes dialed back, replaced by a heavy, profound exhaustion. "Lincoln will bring the cat," Matteo said softly. He walked over to the sofa and crouched down in front of her, ignoring the fact that she flinched slightly as his shadow fell over her. "But you are coming with me, to my home. It is secure." "Am I a prisoner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are under my protection. There is a difference. I don't think Dominic cares about the difference." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "He wanted you. He just used me as the doorbell." Matteo's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered wildly in his cheek. "Dominic is a dead man walking. He just doesn't know it yet. But until I finalize the arrangements, you stay where I can see you. Come." The ride to the penthouse was a blur of tinted windows and silent, heavily armed drivers. Matteo's home was exactly what she expected, and yet completely alien. It occupied the top 2 floors of a glass spire in Tribeca. It was cavernous, minimalist, and suffocatingly quiet. The floors were poured concrete, the furniture angular and uncomfortable. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. It didn't look like a place where a person lived. It looked like a high-end holding cell. "Guest room is down the hall on the left," Matteo said, shrugging off his shoulder holster and laying it casually on a marble console table. The sight of the black matte handgun made Chrissy's stomach perform a slow, sickening roll. "The bathroom is stocked. Take a shower. Wash the office off you. I'll order food." Chrissy didn't argue. She felt hollowed out, entirely depleted of the stubborn energy that usually kept her moving. The shower water was scalding hot. She stood under the rainhead fixture until her skin turned red, scrubbing her hands with expensive cedar-scented soap, until the phantom feeling of the thug's dirty fingers on her collar finally faded. When she stepped out, she found a stack of clothes waiting on the vanity counter. A pair of grey sweatpants and a black, long-sleeved t-shirt. They were Matteo's. They smelled faintly of him. Cedar, starch, and something dark and metallic. She put them on. The hem of the shirt fell past her mid-thigh, and she had to roll the waistband of the sweatpants 3 times just to keep them from falling off her hips. When she padded out into the massive living room, the city was entirely dark, the skyline a glittering grid outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Matteo was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a laptop. A cardboard pizza box sat between them. "It's not from your old route," Matteo said, nodding toward the box. "But it's edible." Chrissy sat on the stool opposite him. She pulled a slice from the box. It was cold. She ate it anyway, the mechanical act of chewing grounding her in the present reality. "So," Chrissy said, staring at a slice of pepperoni. "Dominic, who is he?" Matteo didn't look up from his screen. "A problem. A lower-tier distributor who got ambitious and decided my percentage on the port imports was too high. He sent men to your corporate office, in broad daylight. As I said, ambitious but stupid." Matteo finally closed the laptop. He leaned his elbows on the counter, steepling his fingers. He looked directly at her. He thought if he made a public display he would look strong. He thought he could rattle my cage. "He rattled mine," Chrissy pointed out flatly. "I know." Matteo's voice dropped, carrying a rough, sandpaper edge. "And for that, I am entirely responsible. I brought you into this environment. I saw the debt hanging over you, and I used it to keep you in a chair that put a target on your back." Chrissy stopped chewing. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Beneath the terrifying exterior, beneath the wealth and the violence, he was carrying a suffocating amount of guilt. "You didn't force me," Chrissy said. "I saw the spreadsheets. I knew the shipping routes were fake. I'm 24, Matteo. I'm poor, not an idiot. I knew who you were by day 3. Then why did you stay?" The question was sharp, a demand for the truth. "Because my dad needs his physical therapy," she answered immediately. But as the words hung in the quiet air of the penthouse, she realized they were only half the truth. She looked at the fading scars on his forearms. She remembered the way he had gently taken the pen from her hand at midnight. She remembered the sheer, blinding terror in his eyes when he knelt beside her desk, checking her for injuries before he checked his own men. "And," Chrissy added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "because nobody else bothered to buy me an oversized sweater when I ruined mine." Matteo froze. The space between them across the marble island suddenly felt incredibly small, charged with a heavy, dangerous electricity. Midnight came and went. The pizza box was discarded. The silence of the penthouse stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. Chrissy couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, every shadow morphing into the scarred face of the man from the office. Every creak of the building settling sounded like a heavy boot on marble. At 2 a.m., she gave up. She pushed the heavy duvet aside and padded barefoot out of the bedroom. The living room was dark, save for a single amber reading lamp in the corner. Matteo was sitting in a low armchair, a glass of scotch in his hand. He hadn't changed clothes. He was staring out at the city, but his posture was rigid. He wasn't relaxing. He was standing guard. He heard her footsteps on the concrete and turned his head. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear the bones snapping in that man's wrist," Chrissy admitted, walking slowly toward him. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly intensely aware of how entirely she was swallowed up by his clothing. Matteo looked down at his glass. The amber liquid sloshed gently. "It is not a sound you ever truly forget. You just learn to file it away in a different part of your brain, the part you don't visit often. How many parts of your brain are like that?" she asked. She stopped a few feet from his chair. He looked up at her. In the dim light, the shadows carved harsh, unforgiving lines into his face. He looked older. He looked tired. "Most of it," Matteo said quietly. "My life is a series of locked doors, Chrissy. You don't want to look behind them. There is nothing good there." "You're there." He let out a short, cynical breath. "I am the worst thing behind those doors." "I don't believe that." "You should." Matteo set his glass down on the side table with a sharp clink. He stood up. He was so much taller than her, a towering mass of muscle and quiet menace. But Chrissy didn't step back. She tilted her head up, meeting his eyes. "You saw what I did today. You saw what I'm capable of doing to another human being without a second of hesitation." "I saw what you did to protect me," she corrected him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but it wasn't fear this time. It was a terrifying, reckless clarity. "I was there, Matteo. I saw your face. You weren't angry that they disrespected your territory. You were terrified that they had hurt me." Matteo's jaw clenched. He stared down at her, his eyes dark and chaotic. "You are an innocent. You do not belong in this filth. I should wire $200,000 into your account tomorrow, put you on a plane to California, and never let you near my building again." "I'd just wire it back," Chrissy said stubbornly. "And I hate California. The time zone is weird." Matteo stared at her. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick, suffocating. "You are infuriating," he whispered. "You're a criminal with a hero complex," she shot back. He closed the distance between them. It wasn't a slow, romantic approach. It was sudden, inevitable. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders. His grip was firm, bordering on desperate, as if he were trying to convince himself she was real, that she was solid and unbroken. "Chrissy," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. "Don't send me away," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest flat against his chest. She could feel the rapid, heavy thud of his heart through the fabric of his shirt. "I don't want to run." The last remnants of Matteo's restraint shattered. He didn't ask again. He lowered his head, capturing her mouth in a kiss that was entirely devoid of gentleness. It was a collision. It tasted like scotch and exhaustion and a desperate, clawing need to feel something other than violence. Chrissy gasped against his lips, her fingers curling into his shirt, anchoring herself to him. She didn't pull away. She kissed him back with the same frantic energy, rising up on her toes to meet his height. All the fear of the day, all the adrenaline, all the quiet, agonizing tension of the past 4 weeks poured into the space between them. Matteo's hands slid from her shoulders to her waist, dragging her flush against him. He walked her backward, his steps blind but sure, until her back hit the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The entire city of New York stretched out below them, a sea of lights, oblivious to the quiet earthquake happening in the penthouse above. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. Both of them were breathing hard, their chests heaving in unison. "If you stay," Matteo said, his voice a harsh rasp, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "There is no going back to typing memos. You cross this line, you are mine. The syndicate, the enemies, the violence, it all comes with me." Chrissy looked into his bruised, storm-cloud eyes. She thought of her empty apartment. She thought of the crippling loneliness she had carried for months. Then she looked at the man holding her together. "I've never been afraid of the dark, Matteo," Chrissy whispered, "just of being alone in it." He didn't say another word. He simply leaned down and kissed her again, sealing the contract in the quiet, heavy air of the penthouse. The morning sun was harsh, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse and painting the concrete floors in blinding, angular shapes. Chrissy woke to the smell of strong espresso. She was tangled in heavy linen sheets, alone in the massive guest bed. For a fraction of a second, she thought the previous night was a fever dream. Then she felt the faint, lingering ache in her lips and the scent of cedar clinging to her hair. She padded out into the living area, wrapped in a plush robe she'd found in the closet. Matteo was standing by the kitchen island, fully dressed in a three-piece suit, the color of a bruised midnight sky. He looked immaculate, untouchable. The raw, desperate man who had pressed her against the glass hours earlier was locked away behind a mask of chilling, operational calm. Lincoln sat on one of the bar stools, silently disassembling a heavy, matte black firearm with the casual ease of a man buttering toast. "I have to go," Matteo said. He didn't offer a morning greeting. The air crackled with a lethal, coiled tension. "Lincoln stays with you. Do not open the door. Do not answer unknown numbers. If the building's fire alarm rings, you do not move until Lincoln clears the hallway." Chrissy tightened the belt of her robe. The reality of his world was crashing back down on her, cold and heavy. "Where are you going?" "To correct a mistake." Matteo closed the distance between them, ignoring his second-in-command's presence. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against her cheek. It was a fleeting, terrifyingly gentle touch. Dominic crossed a line. Today I erase his ability to walk over it again. He didn't wait for her to argue. The private elevator doors slid open, and he was gone, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Chrissy sat at the island. She stared at the espresso machine. She stared at Lincoln, who was currently oiling a firing pin. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The quiet was driving a spike of panic straight through her skull. "Lincoln," she said, her voice steadying, "I need a laptop, and I need the administrative logins for the syndicate's shell corporations." Lincoln paused, wiping his hands on a microfiber cloth. He raised an eyebrow. "Boss said to keep you safe, Chrissy. He didn't say to put you to work. You're off the clock." "Dominic is a distributor, right?" Chrissy pressed, ignoring the dismissal. "He moves stolen freight, cars, electronics, whatever. That means he has physical inventory. He needs warehouses. And if he's paying off the dock workers to undercut Matteo, he's bleeding cash to do it." Lincoln squinted at her, his expression shifting from bored to marginally curious. "Yeah, so thugs don't understand tax law. They don't understand commercial real estate zoning." Chrissy stood up, the nervous energy finally finding a channel. "Dominic sent his men to a corporate high-rise in broad daylight. He's not a mastermind. He's impulsive. Impulsive people get sloppy with their paperwork. Get me a laptop, Lincoln. Let me find him." 10 minutes later, Chrissy was curled into the leather armchair, staring at a glowing screen. Lincoln stood behind her. watching the frantic, rhythmic clatter of her fingers across the keys. She wasn't running complex decryption algorithms. She was doing what she did best, connecting dots that arrogant men overlooked. She pulled the city's commercial property tax records. She cross-referenced them with the newly registered LLCs under Dominic's known associates. She layered that data over the municipal trucking weight station logs from the past 3 weeks. "He's not operating out of the ports anymore," Chrissy murmured, her eyes darting across the spreadsheets. The Harbour Patrol tightened their inspection quotas on the 15th. Dominic's inbound freighters have been sitting in the bay for 4 days. He's panicking. "If he's not at the docks, where is he?" Lincoln asked, his voice low. "He needs a place with industrial freezer capabilities for the pharmaceuticals, heavy bay doors for the trucks, and a landlord desperate enough to take cash." She hit the enter key, pulling up a satellite image of a sprawling, rusted complex in Queens. A defunct meatpacking plant in Astoria. The LLC that bought it last week is registered to a woman named Maria Costa. Dominic's mother's maiden name is Costa. Lincoln stared at the screen. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number. "Boss," Lincoln said, never taking his eyes off Chrissy. "Call off the sweep of the docks." She found him. "Yeah, Astoria. I'm sending you the coordinates now." Lincoln hung up. He looked at Chrissy, who was chewing nervously on her thumbnail, the oversized robe swallowing her frame. "Remind me never to lie to you about my expense reports," Lincoln muttered. The hours that followed were an agonizing stretch of static. Chrissy paced the concrete floors. She watched the sun travel across the skyline, turning the city from grey to gold, and finally to a deep, bruising purple. The city below was oblivious to the violence likely unfolding in a rusted warehouse across the river. She was terrified, not of Dominic, but for the man who had promised to stand between her and the dark. The private elevator chimed at 11:42 p.m. Chrissy stopped dead in the center of the living room, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The heavy steel doors slid apart. Matteo stepped into the penthouse. He was ruined. His custom suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with soot, grease, and dark, undeniable crimson smears. His knuckles were split open, swelling and raw. He moved with a heavy, dragging limp, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked like the devil himself, dragged backward through a war zone. Chrissy didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. She crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, sliding her arms around his waist and bearing his weight as he swayed slightly. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, pressing her face against his chest. Matteo let out a long, shuddering breath. His massive arms came up, wrapping around her shoulders, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin like it was oxygen. The violent, untouchable king of the city collapsed into her, shedding the armor he had worn for a decade. "It's done," Matteo rasped, his voice raw and destroyed. "Dominic is dismantled, his product is seized, his men are scattered. He will never, ever come near you again." "Because you beat him to a pulp?" she asked softly, guiding him toward the leather sofa. A dark, exhausted chuckle rumbled deep in Matteo's chest. He sank heavily into the cushions, pulling her down to sit beside him. "Because I walked into his only active stash house, locked his crew in the freezing units, and burned his ledgers. He thought he was playing a war of attrition. He didn't realize I had a weapon that could find his pulse from a laptop in Tribeca." Matteo leaned his head back against the leather, turning his bruised face to look at her. The harsh lines of his jaw were softened by a profound, overwhelming affection. "You terrified him, Chrissy," Matteo murmured, reaching out with a battered hand to trace her jawline. "When I told him how I found him, that my assistant tracked his entire illegal supply chain in 40 minutes using municipal tax codes, He broke. He realized he wasn't just fighting muscle anymore. He was fighting a machine he couldn't comprehend. Chrissy offered a small, watery smile, gently taking his injured hand in hers and examining the split knuckles. Next time, just ask him for his quarterly projections. It's less messy. There won't be a next time. His gaze turned fierce, anchoring her to the spot. I am going to build a fortress around you. A legitimate one. Shell companies, legal assets, untouchable trusts. You are going to run the clean side of the board, Miyakara. You are going to be the queen of this entire city. Chrissy looked at the man beside her. She saw the violence he carried, the shadows that clung to him. But she also saw the absolute, unflinching devotion in his eyes. She wasn't just a clumsy temp anymore. She was the anchor keeping him tethered to humanity, and he was the shield keeping her safe from the world. Okay, she whispered, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to his bruised mouth. But I'm picking out my own office chair. Yours are terrible for lumbar support. Matteo smiled, a genuine, brilliant thing that lit up the dark penthouse. Whatever you want, it's yours. 1 month later, the 42nd floor of the Russo Logistics building hummed with an intense, calculated efficiency. The glass door to the inner office had been replaced. The carpets were spotless. Chrissy sat behind a massive, custom-built mahogany desk that had cost more than her college education. She wore a tailored crimson blazer and black stiletto heels that definitively did not squeak. Her hair was pulled back into a sharp, professional knot. The heavy oak doors of the elevator parted, and bricks lumbered out. He was carrying a pink cardboard box. He approached her desk with the careful reverence of a man approaching an altar. "Morning, boss lady," Bricks rumbled, setting the box down gently. "Cannoli, pistachio, just like you like." "Thank you, Bricks," Chrissy said, not looking up from her dual monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "If this is about the Irish syndicate wanting to renegotiate the sanitation routes, tell them Matteo will take the meeting on Thursday. But their initial offer needs a 20% bump, or we route the trucks through Jersey." Bricks blinked, a slow smile spreading across his scarred face. "You got it. 20%. I'll make this call." He walked away, practically whistling. Behind the glass wall of the corner office, Matteo stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her. He wore a flawless charcoal suit, completely healed, completely in control. But his eyes were entirely fixed on the woman commanding his soldiers with a keyboard and a glare. Chrissy felt the weight of his stare. She paused her typing, looking up through the glass. Matteo didn't wave. He simply tapped his watch, holding up 2 fingers. 2 minutes until lunch. Chrissy rolled her eyes playfully, offering him a small, secret smile before turning back to her screens. She was a disaster who had stumbled into a war zone with $17 and a broken umbrella. But as she authorized a multi-million-dollar wire transfer with a single keystroke, she knew one thing for certain. She had survived the week, and the mafia boss didn't stand a chance. If you loved this story of power, tension, and a clumsy girl turning a criminal empire entirely upside down, hit that like button right now. It really helps support the channel and lets me know you want more gritty, heart-stopping romance dramas. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a ruthless mafia boss with a soft spot for only one woman. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling story. Let me know in the comments, what should our next couple face?